Okay, we're starting Siman Kuf Chof Hey, which is what was scheduled for last week, or was learned last week. Kuf Chof Dalad, we spoke about the paper, about the klaf that is for writing a get. And Siman Kuf Chof Hey essentially deals with the ink, the way you prepare the klaf, and how the certain chumras that are relevant to how to write the get. That means not the wording, but the general rules, like just like there's halachas regarding safras for a sefer Torah and for mezuzah, there's also halachas regarding a get. Some are similar, some are different. So the Shulchan Aruch starts in Sif Aleph with the kind of ink which is needed for a get. The kind of ink has to be something which holds the exact something which is going to be permanent and remain and exist. The examples that the Shulchan Aruch brings of here are all liquid inks, which means inks that are not that are made from herbs or from other pigments that were cooked and prepared in such a way that it turned by heat, it extracted the color from whatever you're trying to do it, and then became concentrated, and that is used as ink. But if you write in something which is not going to be long lasting, for example, if you write with fruit juice, it's not a get, bottle. Sif Beis, it says, but the Eved, if you write with Aver, with Shachor, or with Shichur, it's kosher. What are this Aver, Shachor, and Shichur? So in the Shulchan Aruch, you have in parentheses, Pirush, brings from the Aruch. Now the Pirush, even though in the old prints it's the same design as the Ramah, it's not specifically proven that it actually came from the Ramah. It was in the print, it was in prints also before. And over there, Aver is lead. Shachor is, the way it defines it, is some kind of metal which is used, which is some kind of metal which is used to write with it. And Shichur is coal. Rashi explains it a little bit different. Rashi in the Gemara, okay, Shachor, well, on Aver nobody disagrees that it's lead. But what's Shachor? Shachor is coal, not like Shichur like the Aruch says. And Shichur is adrimant. That's what Rashi says. Taisva says the same thing. Ran says the same thing. What is it? It's something which comes from from copper. So it doesn't mean that you grind copper. It is when metal oxidizes and it turns, you could see it on silver also, but essentially what we'll call it varnish, the black that shows up on metal as it gets eaten up by the air. Now, what does it mean that if you wrote with Aver, Shachor, or Shichur, it's kosher? The Ramah explains, Dafka means that you did not write with the actual Aver, Shachor, or Shichur, with coal, with lead, or with this, what is called the copper oxide, or rather it means that it was put into water and then you use the water to write. So the water absorbed from these things, from this coal or from whatever it is, the water became black and you use it to write. So that's kosher from this blackened liquid. So what is this? This is essentially ties into something which we learned 4 years ago, Lerach. In Kailo, I think only Mendel was here then, so we have at least one Eid Echad for it. That regarding in Mikvahs, when Shinui Mare, so if there's a whole discussion, what makes a mikveh possible with Shinui Mare, if it's actual mamoshes of ink pigments which went into the mikveh, or if it's something which is these, like there's pollution in the air, there's dust, there is black from coal and all these things which went into the water. So the water looks black. It doesn't make the mikveh possible because the water didn't change colors. It just slowly sunk into it. So that's So you have something which changes the color, which means ink is something which absorbed the color and became its own new metzias. And there's water which has in it something else. So that is, so this thing, this is what the Ramah says. These, if you write with them, it's kosher. But you have it. But if you wrote with them themselves, with lead or with coal or with this oxidized powder from metals, so he says yeshayim that it's possible. The Beis Shmuel says doesn't mean possible, it means bottle. Therefore, you should be chayshish to it. Who are these machmirim that yeshayim? You should be chayshish. Yesh lachush. You should be chayshish because there's yeshayim that it's possible, which means bottle. Therefore, yesh lachush. You should be chayshish. And who are the machmirim? The machmirim that it doesn't tell you, but it's Rashi. That's how Rashi explains the Gemara over there, and it's the Tur. And the way the Tur understands his father, the Rosh, and the Ran. Those are the ones that hold that if you write with the actual lead or coal, then the get is bottle. According to the Rif and the Rambam, and according to the Rosh, the way the Drisha understands the Rosh, and you also see it in the Hagoyes, Maharan, Shapiro, which on the Tur, which are printed in the back of the Tur that you have by you in the Likut of all the Hagoyes. He also explains it like the Drisha, that the Rosh follows that opinion. That's exactly the opposite. When does the Gemara say it's kosher? When you actually use these lead or these things to write a get with it. But if you use the liquid, lavdafka, it's kosher. The Bach says, why is it so? Because you're using something which is mamashas to write with it. What's the example? In the olden days, at least the pencils are called lead pencils. I don't think there ever was actual lead in pencils, but at least that's what it's called. So Lu Yitzur, there was lead in pencils. That's what it would be used for. It would be kosher because it's something which has mamashas of color in it. But if it's just water which absorbed, it's a davar she'eina miskayim, and therefore it's not kosher. And that's all the Mishnah explains the shit of the Rambam also. The Rameh takes it further and says that if you use the Rameh explains why is it that if you write with Aver, it's not considered to get this bottle, because it's not begeder ksav. There is writing and then there is marking. And you're going to see later also, we're going to get discussions about what kind of, dripping ink and everything else. There's an act of writing, and there's an act of drawing, and there's an act of spilling ink, and there's an act of making markings. So you could take this chalk and mark on the sidewalk, it's not called writing. Shabbos is a whole different category, what's considered writing and what's not. But over here, the Rameh says when you use coal or when you use lead to write something, you're not writing, you're doing markings. It's called a rishum. It's not eksav, and therefore it's not in the category of a kosav, and therefore they get this bottle. And then Sif Gimel, and then I'm going to go back to all these. I'm just putting the first three Sifim together. You could write it with mei afatzim. What's mei afatzim? To make ink, there is, now, afatzim is gall. Gall in English. Gall. Kind of growth that grows on different plants, and it gets very dark, and you take it and you cook it, you make ink out of it. If you soak it, you don't make ink out of it, you make liquid which absorbs some of the colors, some of the tannins that are inside this. And therefore, if you soaked it in water and the water became dark, so mei afatzim, you could write because it's a davar miskayim. However, if you soaked the klaf in mei afatzim first, that was one of the ways of processing it, so the klaf became dark. So if you're going to write with mei afatzim on top of klaf, which in itself was already soaked in mei afatzim, so even though technically mei afatzim is davar miskayim, it's on top of something which is no longer rishum nikar. And therefore, and therefore it's not a get. Says the mechaber, any other kind of thing, which means the general rule is it has to be a ink which is miskayim and it's nikar.
It's not black. It's black.
It's not. Huh?
It's not black.
It's not black. It's a grayish. So when does it say you have to write a get in black? It doesn't say that. L'chatchila, we write it with black ink, like I said, you can write it with a red pencil. I read ink, or blue ink, or green ink. You know, some people could order those kinds of inks. As long as it's real ink, it's miskayim. Now, if you actually cooked the afatzim in water, and you made ink from it, it's mamash ink, and therefore, this mei afatzim is not talking about ink that's made from afatzim. It's talking about afatzim that got soaked. That's the shita of the Ran, and not like the Tosfos, and that's how the Mittler Rebbe summarized it over here. The chalkas mechoykek, which we already know from the previous siman, that says has a whole diyun in the end of the previous siman regarding ink which is wet. If you gave an ink when the ink is wet, being that it's going to be davar miskayim, might be it's l'chayre kosher. So he says over here something which when it's written it's not miskayim, but when it will dry it will be soifei liskayim. When it will dry up, it's still considered a kosher a get, and even though now you could erase it, the chakas mechagel shitase, and still he says you have to be. It's better not to do it like that. What's interesting is over here there's a different lashon between the Tur and the mechaber. The lashon of the Tur is sherishumoi kayam. Shirishumai nikor. The lashon of the mechaber is shirishumai oimed. The Pri Chadash points it out and says the lashon of the Rambam is rishumai oimed. That means that it's long lasting. It's bar kayama, and that's what the mechaber paskins. But the Tur says shirishumai nikor. That it's visible. And that's how the Bach paskins like it. Which means that as long as at the time of the giving of the get it was Rishumay Nikar, even if it's not Rishumay Oymed that is going to be permanently there, it is considered kosher. The Pri Chadash says the Bach didn't get it. The diuk of the Bach and the Tur is wrong. It's obvious the Tur doesn't want to tell you a separate din is chaylik on the Rambam that it could be Nikar but not Oymed. Rather, the Tur wants to tell you not only it has to be Oymed, it also has to be Nikar. It has to be Oymed, it has to be something which is going to be there permanently. And it also has to be Nikar at the time of giving. And that's how the Taz explains it. That's good. We're going to get the get pashtus goes into it in a second. Yeah, the Taz Pashtus writes that there has to be the Taz. The way the Taz writes it, there's a few words. Pirush haroishim miskayim v'nikar tamid. He puts them all together into one. In 6 words, he combined them both together. And the Pri Chadash says it in short. The get pashtus as usual expands on it a lot more. He brings what the Bach is medayek from the Tur. And he says, he asks a question, according to the Bach, if you have ink, that when you write on it, on the cloth, you have very shiny cloth, and it's easy to write on the cloth. This was a way, the time that they used to write on such cloth. And then you could write on it, and it's gate green, it's very easy, but then it dries up, and if you, from rolling and unrolling it, or folding it, after a few times, the letters are going to start cracking and falling off. That l'chayira, according to the way the Bach understands the Tur, is going to be kosher. Why? Because Rishumay Nikar at the time of giving, even though it's not miskayim. There's still a little bit of rishum remains on the cloth afterwards, but the actual ink falls off. And he says it makes absolutely no sense to say such a thing. And obviously, that even according to the Tur, it has to be kayam. But the Tur wants to tell you both that it has to be nikar and it has to be miskayim, and therefore in this kind of ink, which which will jump off afterwards, which is nikar, but not miskayim, it's not a get. Same thing the other way around. If it's me'afatzim on top of klaf, which also got absorbed with me'afatzim, it's miskayim, but it's not nikar, so it's also not a get. So now, stakashe, how could you write a get on the hand of an eved? If you don't tattoo the get onto the hand of the eved, then with time the ink is going to fade away because of the sweat and of the heat of the body. He says over there, the reis is not because of the ink, the reis is because of something external. So therefore it's not a problem. But over here it's a reis with the ink, which is also something hard to understand, and I'm soon going to see the Get Makusha disagrees on that. That's the point he brings out. He says this about the jumping ink, it also doesn't fall apart because of it. But we're going to get to the Get Makusha soon. He says not. He says if you just write it stam, not tattooing it on the Eved. Just write it in the hand of the Eved. And he says, and even though when it comes to paper or to the klaf, we had in the previous siman the machlekes whether the paper has to be miskayim lizman rav or not. The machlekes rishonim regarding writing on vegetable leaves. He says that's only regarding the paper. Regarding the ink, there's no machlekes. The kuli alma has to be ink, which is going to be kayam. Why? Because v'kosav is written clearly in the pasuk, and ksav is ksiva, which means the ksiva has to be done properly, so therefore it has to be done on miskayim. But regarding the klaf, regarding the paper, it says sefer. Yeah, get has to be a sefer. Sefer means a place just sipur dvarim. It doesn't tell you that it has to be a permanent sefer. So therefore, by that, there's a place to argue regarding the paper. But when it comes to the ink, there's no arguments. Pischat Shu over here brings his get pashut, and right away brings the get makushut. And he says, the get makushut says, I don't understand the svare of the get pashut regarding this ink, which after some time jumps off the paper. He says the same logic that the get pashut says regarding writing on the hand of the eved applies also to this, because the ink is a good ink, the klaf is a good klaf. If you're not going to walk around folding and unfolding the get, it will remain there. So it's also a davar chitzoni, just like by the yad of the eved, that it only goes because of the sweat, and therefore it's considered miskayim. And the Teilas Gitin says the same thing. It's also considered miskayim if you write on this kind of klaf. But the Teilas Gitin points out, still there has to be only if you know that there's shumay nikar, that after you're going, even after the letters will fall out, there'll still be some form of visible on the klaf that there used to be some writing over here, and you're able to see what the writing is.
Residue.
Huh?
The word is residue.
Residue. Thank you. And the get pashut continues, and he says in Sifkat and Hey regarding Mei Peiris, that if you write with coffee, tzarich yun. He doesn't know. Shaila. Chayla is like Mei Peiris. I don't know why he considered like Mei Peiris. It's if anybody ever saw stains, you could see, you could buy books today that are 200 years old, and you can still see coffee stains on them. But yeah, that's what they get pashut right, so I'm not going to argue with him. Now, he says tzarich yun, doesn't know the ma'aseh. He thinks it's like Mei Peiris, doesn't know the ma'aseh what it is. Now, what happens to write with disappearing ink or invisible ink, which later becomes? It's a more modern shilas. So there is no real discussion about the Nichas Gitin. The whole discussion of it is one big old discussion at Yisrael. Been doing the Paiskim at Yisrael 30, 40 years ago, maybe more. If doctors that have to write notes in the hospital on Shabbos, soldiers that have to write on Shabbos, how are they going to do it? If you're going to write mamish with something which is a ksav. So you have in the book Nishmas Avram, Erechaim Siman Shin Mem, Mem Ches, that he says, he proves that even if something lasts for 3-4 days, it's still considered Einoi Miskayim. I think he brings it from Shem Zaman Arbach. And therefore, he says in Nishmas Avram, if a doctor or a soldier has to write something on Shabbos, he should write it with the left hand, with a shinui, with this kind of disappearing ink. And if it's going to last for 3-4 days, it's not considered davar miskayim. So therefore, the chayra also for a get, it's not considered davar hamiskayim because it's going to disappear. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu also dealt with this shaila in Tchum and Chelik Yud Aleph, and he also says that if it's not miskayim over there, he points out the whole discussion is not considered miskayim leaning Shabbos. Says, but derech hagav is also not miskayim leaning get. And he says over there, and therefore, if you're going to write a get with it, the get is not kosher with disappearing ink. But on the flip side, you have a Mishnah Brura and Sha'ar Tzion Siman and Siman Shin Gimel, Sha'ar Tzion Sifkot and Samach Ches. Over there is Medayik from a Rambam regarding Tzoiveya, regarding Koichel Einayim. That if it's Niskayim only for Shabbos, it's already considered Davar HaMiskayim. And therefore, based on that, you could say by a get, if disappearing ink will last for a day, according to Mishnah Brura, it should be kosher. However, there are those that say that they have this problem with this Rambam, and there's a stir in the Rambam, and they're metaretz based in Yerushalmi that so you can't learn from Tzeveya to Kaisav. There's a din in Tzeveya and there's a din in Kaisav. A din in Tzeveya regarding makeup, and there's a Kaisav is a different din. So therefore, just by Tzeveya, the din is that if it's Miskayim until the end of Shabbos, it's considered Miskayim. Doesn't mean that by Kaisav it's Miskayim for 3-4 days, it's considered a Davar Shakayam. Okay, so that is regarding disappearing ink. So the Chayra, it does not good. Even if I'll be medayik from Mishnah Brura, the Mishnah Brura is based on the Rambam, which regarding the Rambam himself is a machlokes how to understand. Let's flip it. What happens if you're not writing with disappearing ink, but you're writing with ink which you can't see now? I don't know, one of the things that you do as kids, one of the things that you could do is you take lemon juice and you could write on the paper and you don't see anything, and then you pass it on the fire and then suddenly the acid will brown it and suddenly a drawing will come up. So what happens if you write white on white and you can't see it, and afterwards you're going to put it on the fire, you're going to pass it through something and it's going to show up, or it's going to show up later by itself. So this was not invented now. This was a long time ago invented. There's a Prima Godim in the Shabbos. Mishpet says Zahav Siman Shin Mem Sifkot and Gimel. Over there he says if somebody writes with raw milk, unpasteurized milk, that was how they did it then. It's not nikkur on paper. And then came a friend, and he took this paper and he waved it on top of the fire, and therefore when it dried, you see the letters. So he says, okay, he's not over ksiva on Shabbos. The one who, he doesn't talk about the guy who even wrote with the milk. He's talking only about the second guy. So the second guy, it's also midrabanan because it's daimel ksiva, which means that if you write with something which right now you can't see it, this ksav is also not going to. It has no gedder of ksav based on this Prima Godim. And therefore, if you're going to write a get with ink, which is going to show up only later, which is not visible unless you do something to make it visible, it's also not a get. Yeah, that's regarding that. Let's go back to the writing with aver, with lead. Right, so we had over there that we have some Rishonim would say that it's dafke kosher b'diavad if you use the water which soaked it, and that's what the Ramah says v'yeshlachos lo devreim. He says that that's the only time it's kosher, but if you write be'ever mamish yeshlachos lo devreim, it's bottom in atayra. And you have the people who hold faket, they from the Rambam. They get posher and Sifkot and Yud says. Kedar Koy in a lot of other places in the גיטין, machlokes Rishonim lekan without achra b'machmir both ways. Therefore, he's not machshir schaylik in the Ramah. He's not machshir and the mechaber essentially. He says because there's no achra, machmir both ways. Whether you wrote it with aver itself or whether you wrote it with water which absorbed aver, it's not a good get. So therefore, if you write with a pencil, if it would have lead, it would be not a kosher get. However, today's pencils, or pencils for quite a long time, you see that it lasts for a very long time, pencils. There's things that were written in pencil, okay, it fades out much quicker than pens because it's different than ink. Ink is liquid and it gets absorbed. Pencil is not a liquid, and it starts cracking and disappearing. And the chayra should be the same thing, it shouldn't be kosher. But l'chayra, if it stays for a long time, and the only reason that it falls off the paper is because of passage of time, according to the svara of the get kosher, but the evidence should be kosher. Why? Because the chisaron is only with passage of time. There's humidity, there's this, there's that, which causes it to fade away. And the only question is, today, how is it made? Pencils are made from graphite, which is a kind of coal. And therefore, it's maybe not Ever, it's maybe Shachir or Shichur. And then you can go into discussion, is Rishumei Nikar or not? So if Rishumei Nikar, then there's a svara to say that it's still kosher, if it's Rishumei Nikar for a long time. If it's not Rishumei Nikar, that you could erase it with this, if you have a good eraser, if you have a pencil, that if you have a good eraser, you can completely erase it and there'll be no zecher whatsoever to what was there before, then forget about this whole discussion in Siman Kuf Chafei. You have a much bigger problem. You go into the shaila if you could write with Davar Shechel is daif or not. Because then something which could be erased is in the category of something which could be misdayif. That is a different shaila. In the end of Sif Beis, the Ramah says that the minhag is to write the get with good ink, just like you write Sifrei Torah ve'ein l'shanos. You don't change the minhag. And he says another din that Ramah says in the end of Sif Beis, yesh machmirim, that the sefer should read every letter before he writes, just like by a Sefer Torah. And both of these things are, at least the second one, the Yikra Kol Ois, is hard to understand. I'm going to get to it soon, but first let's deal with this good ink that the Ramah says you have to write with. So the Get Pashat says, well, the Ramah is just trying to tell you that it means ink which cannot be erased. Because ink that can be erased, you're going to need Eidem Mesirah. And if you could erase it and it's not going to be, and it's going to be nikar, then it's not considered yochel is dayef, and it's kosher with edich siman. So basically what the Ramah is trying to tell you is write with ink to avoid the problem of ksav sheyochel is dayef. That's the diyot toiv over here, but not much more. Not that you have to have kosher ink like you have for Sefer Torah, specific ink which is made in a specific way, which you don't have to have the same restrictions for a get. But the Ramah also adds another thing, which is you have to read, before you write the get, you have to read every word, every letter. So if you write be'echad, yesterday was Sunday, so you write be'echad b'Shabbos. So if you say be'echad b'Shabbos, the service can say be'echad beis, and it writes the beis. Aleph, ches, dalet, and then continue reading. The Get Pashat says, even by Sefer Torah and Tefillin, it says you only have to read word for word from the tikkun. You don't have to read the letter by letter. It's lo shamaynu. It's enough. He reads every word before he starts. And he says, but just like, so he says this letter by letter you don't need to do. But just like you have by Sefer Torah, you have to copy from an existing tikkun. You don't rely on your memory. Same thing, by a get, you should have in front of you an old get from which you could copy, so you don't miss a word. However, both of these are good things, but it's not mandatory. In the Seder, it says yesh machmirim. Doesn't say that it's only a minhag tov. It says yesh machmirim. The Get Pashat says kol ois b'chlal, no basis. Read every word, and from an existing get, that's the good thing to do. The Maramri in Seder HaGet, in the end of, it's in the back of the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Ein Ches, says just you should read every word. It doesn't say you have to read every letter. Same thing is not a Chashulchan Sif Zayin. However, in the book Kovetz Al Yad from the Rav of Baltimore, he says in Se'are Daled that he heard that by the Moshe Feinstein he wanted every letter to be read when the Sefer wrote it, to have every letter being read. I didn't see it being done before the get. We'll get to after the get, what happens after the get. We're talking about before the get, as he's writing to do it. I never saw anyone else doing it. Now, in Agoy's Baruch Frankel on the Shulchan Aruch, it says that if somebody else reads for the Sefer the words, it also works. The Sefer doesn't have to be the one reading a word and then writing it. It could be somebody else sitting across from him and saying Be'echad, and he'll write Be'echad, stuff like that. And he says, because it also works in the Sefer Teres, over here it also works. The Aruch HaShulchan over here in Sefer Zayin says, better not to have somebody else read for you, just like in the Sefer Teres, it's better not somebody else read for you, you should do it yourself. And based on that, there are certain Batidin where the Rav HaMesader reads it to the Sefer, but also not so common. In Chasam Sofer, he says, if you read it after the get, since the minhag is you read it after the get, he says that if the way it's done is the Sofer reads it, or somebody else reads it, and two people, one reads it, and the other person checks the letters to make sure that it matches. So two people together, they do the review of the get. One makes sure that no words are missing, it checks parallel to it, and he sees if each word is missing a letter or not. And the Maramri says, based on that, he says instead of just having a plain get, an old get in front of you with a different date to copy from, you should actually have an old get where you will write, you could write with a pencil and then you could cross it out. On top of the places, you should fill in what today's day is and what names are you going to be using. So when you copy from the old get, you're not going to also copy the wrong date and the wrong names. And the Seder and the Maramri says, if you do that, you don't have to read before, and you don't have to read afterwards.
Well, I understand. So what do you, if you're not comparing things, what do you read?
No, you see it in front of you, but you don't have to read out loud and say every letter. Yeah, every word out loud. All you have to do is you have it in front of you and you copy from one to the next one. So you have an old get in front of you and you already filled in before you started writing the get, where it says the name, you put a line with a pencil and you wrote on top of it whatever the person's name is, Chaim Yankel, on the old one, and from that you copy, yeah. Now, the Kav Naki on this Seder Get Rishon, on the Seder Aget from Aramri, Sifkot Lamed Aleph, brings from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch in Siman Lamed Beis, If Mem Gimel, says that regarding Tefillin, this only works to copy, that you don't have to read every word out loud, to copy from an existing one, only by Tefillin, because it's Shogur B'fiv Shel Sefer. The Sefer is so used to it that he knows it by heart, or hopefully davens every day. So he knows Shema, he puts on Rabbeinu Tam, obviously it's a Sefer Yeshamayim, so he knows the four parshas that he has to write. So it's Shogur B'fiv. But if for whatever reason it's not Shogur B'fiv of the Sefer, he has a bad memory or doesn't put on Rabbeinu Tam, then, and he also doesn't read those two parshas like the minhag of other Krayas not to read it after davening, then he has to read it every word B'fiv in his mouth. And he says, in the Kavnok, he says, however, even though the Alter Rebbe says that, B'poil, if you look in the biur of the Maramri to the Seder Haget, by a get you could be Mekel, if you have one of them, either copy from an existing one or read word for word before writing it. And he says, Medina, you don't even need, the Maramri says, Medina, you don't need even one of them. If you want to be Machmer, you only need one of the two.
Either the copy or to...
Yeah.
Or to what?
Or to read it. In Sif Daled, we move on to a whole different discussion. Until now we discussed writing, how to write. Now, what's the forms of writing? So the Sif Daled, the Mechaber says, if you engraved letters on a metal sheet, or on a rock. So if you engraved into the metal, so the letters are inwards, that it's pushed inwards, or you flipped it over and you engraved in reverse, so therefore when you flip the get back up, it shows up in front of you, you see the letter sticking out, then it's kosher. Why? The reason is, ultimately this is a ma'aseh ksiva. You're writing letters, but by engraving or by doing reverse engraving. But if you didn't actually do engraving of the letters, rather you just shaped the metal around the letters and therefore the metal was visible sticking up, or you did like they do coins, which means you took the shape of a letter and you zetzed it on top of the metal, and by the pressure the letter just popped out, then it's not a get. And this is what is called chak toichos. Chak miloshen chakak, that you do the chakike, but it's toichos, that from that it came out the letter by itself, and that's possible. It's not eksav, because the letters were not done by you. You did an action which caused the letters to pop out by themselves. But if you do chakike for the whole letter or the shape of the letter, then it's kosher, and that's considered chak yerechos. That you are chakak the yerechos, the around the letter to create a letter, to make a letter. The Rama adds over here that the psul of chak toichos is only if the whole letter was done like that. But if you only did part of the letter as chak toichos, and to be able to complete it, the letter, to make it a full letter, you had to actually do more action, which is a kosher action, and then the letter is kosher. Now what's the problem with chakike of this form, the chak toichos? Because the pasuk says v'kosav, not v'chakak. So chakike, which is not ksiv, is awesome. And if you do it in a toiref, bottom of the raisa, because you don't have the v'kosav. And even though regarding Shabbos, this form of chakike, of chak toichos, you also chayev, it's not the same when it comes to get. By a get, chak toichos is not considered ksiva. And why is it that if you didn't complete the letter with chak toichos and then afterwards you finish the letter, it's still kosher? The Chalkas Mechagig over there explains is because the completion of the letter is what makes it a letter, and without it you didn't have anything. So therefore, even though you didn't do v'kosav on the full letter, because the completion of the letter was v'kosav, therefore it's still considered so. The Beis Yosef brings the same thing on the Tur, and he says, the Beis Yosef says, even though Trumas Hadeshin is not clear if this is kosher or not, happens to be the Rama is machriya, like the way the Beis Yosef understands it. Even though then the Rama says that's what the Trumas Hadeshin means, that it is kosher even if you don't complete the letter. And because until you finish the letter, the Taz says, until you finish the letter, you're mechusar ma'aseh. The letter is mechusar ma'aseh. And the example that Taz brings is if you have to write a chaf and you wrote a nun with chak toichos, so therefore you didn't finish the letter. It's a full letter. That's not the letter you need. The letter you need is a chaf. So you did chak toichos as a nun, and you completed it to a chaf, then it's considered kosher. Now, what happens if you have a drop of ink fell on the cloth, on the paper? You're writing a get, and for whatever reason, a tiny drop of ink fell on the place. So now you could create a letter, that means use that drop and design a letter that drop is incorporated into that letter. That's what the Beis Shmuel says. However, if you take a dropper and you'd make drops, dots of ink, and then it shapes up like a letter, and that's how you wrote a whole get. It's not considered a ksav. It's considered dripping ink. It's not considered writing. And if the Pri Chadash says, and then if afterwards you went and you took a kulmus and you connected the dots, then it's pasul midrabanan. And if you did not connect the dots, it's batul midiraisa. Why is it pasul midrabanan? He says because in the Gemara is a machlekes. When is it pasul? And being that it is nachra, it's pasul. The Ramah continues and says that l'chatchila you should not write with a metal kulmus. Why? So you shouldn't come to chakika. And the Bishmul has a question right on the spot. He says, what do you care if it comes to chakika? If you're going to engrave with the kulmus shel barzel into the klaf, it's chakireches. It's kosher. So what's the problem? So he says that Ramah was chayshish. Maybe you're going to come to a shaila of chak teiches by doing it, and therefore you shouldn't do it. It's a shvere svara. The Pri Chadash writes in it that it's a chumra b'loi tam, on this chumra of the Ramah, of not to write with a metal kulmus. Taz also says he doesn't like the svara. For a different reason. The Taz says it's not a good svara, and therefore the Taz says if you have to write with a kulmus of metal, you could write with a kulmus of metal. The Pesach Tshuva brings a Levush. The Levush also had a problem with this. And he says it makes no sense to say that the reason you should not write with a kulmus shel barzel is because of your shema, you're going to come to chakika. He says that's not a valid reason. He says that the Levush comes up with a different reason. What's the reason? V'kosav means one ksav, not ksav on top of a ksav. So if you're going to use a metal kulmus, the metal kulmus is going to dig into the cloth first, and then you made a letter with the digging, and then the ink went on top of it. So it became a ksav al gabi ksav, ksav al gabi ksav. In certain scenarios, it's possible. So the Pesach Tshuva brings a get pashut on it, and it says the get pashut says on the Levush, as far as no mokri, ksav al gabi ksav is possible. Huh? He explains in certain scenarios. You're going to get soon what he says. He says this ksav agav ksav in a get in this scenario there's no mocker that it's possible. That a ksav on top of a chakika is possible. So therefore the get pashut says the reason is different. If you're writing on thin paper, because the minhag is today to write on thin paper, the metal will rip up the paper. But you have a shayla, so when with taka we do know that ksav agab ksav in certain scenarios is possible. So the Pesach Tshuva brings from the Yeshuas Yaakov, that brings from the Trumas Hadeshin, the ksav agab ksav is only possible when the bottom ksav is possible. So if you have a possible ksav on the bottom, and then you wrote on top of it a new ksav, the same letters, let's say the one who wrote it was the Mechal Shabbos, or somebody who's possible to write, or for whatever reason. And a new sefer came and just wrote on top of it. So that ksav, agabe ksav, pasul is pasul. But stam ksav agabe ksav is not a problem. So we still have a question. What is the reason? So Taki, you have the svara of the get pashut, which is that you're going to rip a metal kulmus is going to rip thin paper. And so they have the Teres Gitin combines a little bit the svaras, and it says we're not talking about that the ksav that you have a lot of ink in your kulmus and you dig into the cloth and you do a chakika and right away the ink fills in the chakika. That's not a problem. He says if you don't have enough ink, you're starting to write and you didn't realize, and you wrote. So when you have a feather, you write, you realize, you dip it back in. By a metal one, could be you already made a scratch, you already made a letter with it, and then it's not that the ink and the chakika came in one shot. It's first came the chakika, so it's one ksav. Then came the ink, which is a different ksav, and that could be a shaila of ksav al gabe ksav, Why? If it will be the Eidim doing such a thing, maybe the moment they finished that letter with the metal kulmos and they finished scratching out you have to write Pliny ben Pliny Eid. So the Dalid of Eid, or whatever it is, was done with Chakika, not with ink. Then Kvarasu Shluchusam. They finished their job. The Pesach Tshuva says, I don't understand what Teres Gitin is saying. Asu Shluchusam is irrelevant today because you say Admeo Gitin. So this whole Asu Shluchusam question became irrelevant 4 Simanim ago, so I don't understand what it is. Therefore, Pesach Tshuva concludes, we don't have a good reason for what the Ramah says. Therefore, Maskan is like the Taz. If you have to write with a Kol Shel Barzel, write. If not, don't write with a Kol Shel Barzel. Don't get yourself into shilas, because ultimately the Ramah says so. But Lamaise, it's not a problem. A pen, yeah, the metal tip pens, yeah. No, it depends. If you have felt tips, it's not ink. Even if you press it, you don't always see. There's no chakika. Yeah, a little bit. You have when you write with a kulmus, you also have a little bit. You also have a little bit of indentation. On paper, yeah. The Beis Shmuel brings over there that and that if you printed a get, then it's kosher b'diavad. He brings it from the Rameh of Pano. What does it mean it's kosher? What is it talking about? Printing, obviously, and then we're going to get to, obviously we're talking about the old time printing when they had the lead letters and you went and you zetz them into ink and then you zetz them on top of the paper. Pri Chadash explains, Pshittus, it doesn't say b'diavad. First of all, the Rameh doesn't say b'diavad. It's the Beis Shmuel, when he quotes the Rameh, he adds the b'diavad. The Pri Chadash says that printing is like writing. Why? It's Ksava Miskayim on top of Dovra Miskayim. The Rameh of Pano is Machsher at Lachatchila. The Rameh of Pano is Machsher even that the Eidim should do it like that. And even though some people say it's possible even b'diavad by Tfus, still says the Pri Chadash says still kosher. Not only that, even if you do the whole get in one shot, not letter by letter or word for word, you do all the letters and then you zetz it as one shot. It's also kosher. Elamai, the Pri Chadash says that when it comes to Chasimas or Eidim, don't do it with print. Why? Because it's not going to be nikar and you have to be mekayim the Chasimas. But otherwise, it is kosher. The whole get to be like that. The get Pashat brings it also. This Rameh of Pano. He brings them the Shas Chuvas Masas Binyamin, which also brings the Rameh Pano. And he says, but Masas Binyamin says, still no, you should not do it lachatchilas. This is the makar of the Beis Shmuel, that same logic that Rameh of Pano is machsheres, you can't say it's possible, but even though still no, you should not do it. You should not do it lachatchila. And the get Pashat says on the Masas Binyamin, I don't understand why he says lachatchila you shouldn't do it. There's nothing wrong with it. He says, even though maybe there'll be a little bit of chakika with the pressure of the metal on it, it's still kosher. And he continues at length, and he goes into a whole discussion that all the people that discuss this is discussing regarding three things: so writing a Sefer Torah like that, writing a get like that, and the side discussion if things which are printed are chayav b'gniza or not. And there, and the get Pashat says, it continues at length, this is Maskana is kosher. Same thing as Maskana is also kosher with a kulmos shel barzel. Why? Because even though there's a little bit of chakika, the chakika and the ksiv b'oim ka'echad, and it's not a ksav agab ksav, and and therefore it's not a problem. However, what happens, and then he goes into another. So this is regarding printing. We're still going to get to printing soon. Get back to printing. In Sifkat and Tazayin, the Get Pashat moves to the next thing. It brings the Lavush that if you made, if you did a ink, you poured ink on the paper in a way that it became white on black. That means you drew a beautiful get, but not by drawing the letters, but by drawing black around it, and the letters remained white. He says it's not Iksav. It's not considered Iksav. You didn't do any Maise in the guf of the letters. You said, go color the paper, and the letters came by itself. And the Lavush says the get is bottle, and the get Pashat says in it, Udvarav Emes V'Tzedek.
Who says bottle?
The Lavush. It's not Iksav. There's no Maise Ksiva. The Shulchan also says it's mutter to get al yedei tfus. Taz in Yeridea, in Ilchas Evetera, also says over there that tfus is like writing. And he says, the Taz over there says, still you should not l'chatchila write the get by tfus, by printing, because it's maybe a little bit daima l'chakika. Even though over here he says if you need to, you could do it with a kol mashal barza. He says it's still daima l'chakika. Which means that if you're going to use wooden letters, then it's still kosher.
But I think even that people who say it's kosher, no?
Huh?
Chakir said it's kosher, no? There's someone who said it's kosher.
Yeah, but the Mechaber said, the Ramah says you shouldn't use a kol mashal barzel. There's other issues with writing a get by tfus. You can't be makna the machine to the Baal. And even if you are, you can't use the heter of the Beis Shmuel, that by schari that you pay the sefer, you kind of scale him b'diavad, because no sefer for the $150 is getting, or $20 getting paid for the get is giving you a $100,000 printing machine if he has one of those old machines. But that's all in the old printing presses, which was actual hand motion. So what's today's printing is gone. It's ma'aseh koyach ba'alma. Even though you click print on the computer, it's koyach koyach. And even by inkjet, there's still nothing. And if it's an old style one, the old printing presses or a typewriter, we'll get the typewriter soon, somebody will get to it. Then, if you did it similar to it, maybe it's kosher, according to those shittas. And if you avoid the problem of chakika, for example, you make a stamp. Today you could print stamps from these printers. They could print you a stamp, you could make a whole get on the paper, and you just take it, stick it onto ink, and zets it on top of a piece of paper, and you have a get. And it's made from silicone, which doesn't do any chakika. Maybe it would be good if it's made from rubber or silicone. According to the Pri Chodesh, that doing the whole thing in one shot is fine. And if you do word for word, this chayr is also fine. And if you have a typewriter, you have a problem of chakika, right? But let's say you avoid the problem of chakika, because we're only talking about b'di'evid. The Shas HaTshuvas Chelkas Yoyev, Evan Siman Kuf Ches, says it's also to write a get in a typewriter. But he doesn't say it's also because of any of the reasons that we discussed. Not because you have to do the words, not because it's tfus, not because it's chakika. He says because this is going, even though according to Svar and Shas is going to be kosher, is going to cause that Yehei Hadover Mosur Lakoil, everybody's going to want to do it. Vesidur get Yovei Lamadrega Sidur Kiddushin, Shekol Bur Vereik Yehei Mesadroi, Vezeyigroim Churban Godel Vehirus Lataras HaMishpacha Yisraelis. Says it's going to create chaos that each guy is going to feel that he could, if he has a typewriter at home, he could start typing up a get, and it's going to create a problem. That's why he says it's asur. So now, if you have kol mashal barzel, we say it's a problem, right? But if you need to, the Taz says you could do it. So pens that are a problem. But if you have a felt tip marker, Sharpie, or if you have, today you have kulmuses which are made from ceramic or from silicone or from any of these things. L'chayra doesn't cause a problem of chakika, so it l'chayra would be, it for sure would be kosher to write with l'those ones. Obviously l'chatchila, the Mechaber writes later on in the Siman that you have to do it with a like a sefer, with a kana, with a, but it's not. But if you need to, you can write a get with a felt pen if you know what you're doing. Now, what happens if you want to print a stencil a get? That means you print a sheet which already has the holes for the letters, and you fill in the letters letter by letter. In Siman Kuf Lamed, it discusses if Edom don't know how to sign their names. The Ramah over there in Sifta Zayin says if Edom don't know how to sign, then mekar'in niyar cholak lifneim v'imchosim derech hakera. You rip on the paper the shape of the letters, and the Eidim will sign through the rips. And this is what the Ramah brings it from the Tur, which brings the name of the Ramah. How do you do it? You create the shape of the letters in the paper. You put the paper on top of the get, and they fill the ripped parts with ink. And the Tur says that's how Rabbi Chanan al-Paskins. Also, the Beis Yosef brings right on top of the Tur. The Beis Yosef says the name of the Rashban, Rabbi Yerucham, and the Mordechai. Doesn't mean that they actually fill in exactly to the whole shape of the letter, because then you can't be Mekayim the Chesimus, because it's somebody else's ksav, not their ksav. So therefore, you make the shape in the paper bigger than what they have to, and they just see the shape, and they draw inside the line, but not fill up the whole opening in the paper.
Why is that
No ksav agav ksav. Not engraving anything. It's a piece of paper on top of the get. It's a separate piece of paper, stencil. It's a piece of paper with holes in it, to have the shape of the letter. So, ba'etzim, it comes from there that writing, it's for sure considered writing. Elamai, by Eidim, you have to have a problem with Kiyum Chesimus. So therefore, by a Sefer, it should not be a problem b'chlal, to fill it up. But if you're going to go and you're going to pour ink on top of it, rather than use a paintbrush, you just wipe ink on top of it, on top of all the holes of the stencil, it's not going to work. Because l'chayra, you could say that it's you didn't do a ma'aseh ksiva. You did a ma'aseh of painting. It's not v'kosav. All you did was you poured ink on top of the paper, and the ink went through the paper, and then it dried, and you picked up the paper, which had ink on it, and then suddenly letters showed up. So that's not considered ksiva. If you use the stencil to shape the letters, then it's fine. Stamp is not the same thing. Stamp has the letters shaped already. You did a ma'aseh of ksiva. You put it on. First you put it into the ink, and then you take your hand and you zest it on top of the paper, just like printing. It's not good if you just pour ink on top of the whole paper, because then the ink went by itself, and after it dried up, it became by. If you're going to take a kulmus or a marker and write within the holes that you designed, then it should be fine. Yeah, but you could still argue back and forth, because you could say that even by printing, you could say that the letters are being written by your hand motion. Over here, there's no hand motion that you're doing. You're pouring ink. There's no hand motion you're doing until you peel off the stencil off the paper. You're peeling off a stencil off the paper. You're creating letters by doing that, and that's not the act of writing. That's the act of coloring. Or it's an act of like dripping, the dripping and making. Still not considered ksiva. And just as a side note, about 20 years ago, there was somebody who came up with this idea. He's already in Elam Emes, I think now, to do sefer Torahs like that, to have silk printing, silk screen. And he explained B'tuv Tan V'das why it's kosher. The whole Welt came out against it. And l'chayra, the same svaras that make it also by sefer Torah make it also by a get, but silk screening is not the same as what I just told you. What I'm telling you is, if you have a stencil and you have the letters shaped, so you can make a nice ksav, and you write within it, you take a kulmus and you write inside the stencil, so that way you don't lose the exact size. If you're not such a perfect sefer, then l'chayra it would be kosher. With that, we conclude.